My mother blamed and resented me for my father's near, fatal accident. I was like a thorn in her side. I had always known that my life wouldn't be like those feel-good movies, nor was I adopted into a family where the age gap could be easily bridged. With another generation between us, I was the anomaly at family gatherings, the young face among wrinkled smiles, a boy in a world of history I could barely grasp. My father, born in 1927, was a World War II veteran. His silence told a story his words never could. My mother, a decade younger, carried a gentleness that time had eroded and had a deafness in her left ear. This made her world as one-sided as her hearing. Now 34, I reflected on a period from about 12 to 15 years ago that had changed the course of my relationship with my parents, especially with my mom. That period became a chasm that widened over time, filled with silence and misunderstandings. The incident that started it all was as mundane as it was tragic. One night, the comfort of sleep was abruptly replaced by a startling thud from my father's room. In the haze of half-sleep, I dismissed it, thinking one of our animals had knocked something over or that my dad had stumbled during his nightly bathroom routine. I chose the warmth of my bed over investigating. It was a decision that would haunt me for years. Morning light brought the harsh reality. My nephew's scream, filled with horror, pierced the usual silence and jolted me out of bed. Rushing into my father's room, I was confronted with a scene that would replay in my mind countless times. My father lay beside his bed, a blanket tightly wrapped around his neck, his skin an alarming shade. Adrenaline kicked in, and I managed to lift him back onto the bed and unwrap the blanket. His breathing was shallow and labored. The arrival of the ambulance and the rush to the hospital were a blur. The layout of our house, with my room next to my father's, became a detail in the blame directed at me. Somehow, this fact led others to believe I should have been able to foresee and prevent the accident. But in my half-asleep state, it never occurred to me that my father could fall out of bed. Due to his health problems and mobility issues after the accident, my adoptive parents decided to sleep in separate bedrooms. This practical arrangement, however, isolated my father. His room was upstairs while my mother's was downstairs. That fateful night, my mother, with her good ear turned away and her deaf side exposed to the ceiling, didn't hear the fall. Neither did I. Her deafness wasn't new, we had all adapted to it over the years, but in the aftermath, it felt like a cruel irony. The guilt of that night weighed heavily on me. The what-ifs haunted my thoughts. What if I had been fully awake? It was as if my proximity to my father's room gave me a responsibility I was unaware of, a guard duty I failed. After the incident, my father's health deteriorated, and he was admitted to a veteran's home. The air in our house was thick with tension. Every word and gesture seemed to filter through the lens of my mother's guilt, grief, and anger, which she directed at me. It didn't matter that the fall was an accident. In her eyes, I was the culprit, the reason her husband now lay in a veteran's home, his once robust spirit diminished. The initial conflict was a crack in the dam of our family dynamic, releasing a flood of long-suppressed frustrations and resentments. My mother's accusations became the soundtrack of my life at home. Nightly conversations were like walking through a minefield. Every word I said was scrutinized and found lacking, and every silence was loaded with accusation. The more she accused, the more I withdrew, retreating into a shell of indifference to protect myself from the pain of her words. When I decided to join the army, it felt like the first step towards a new path. But my mother didn't see it that way. After I filled out the necessary forms, she took matters into her own hands. She spoke to the army recruiter, a conversation I wasn't privy to. She told them I had changed my mind, that I couldn't go through with it. Her authoritative words painted a picture of doubt and indecision that was not mine. It was a deliberate act, born out of her desperation to keep me home to take care of my father. Realizing she would go to such lengths was both heartbreaking and infuriating. This betrayal strained our relationship even further, clearly showing that my desires and aspirations were secondary to her need to keep the family unit intact, regardless of the cost to my dreams and autonomy. In the face of the collapse of my plans and the unbearable atmosphere at home, I made a decision that would change the course of my life for the next few years. College, a backup plan I never intended to use, became my lifeline. The acceptance letter from a university 200 miles away was my ticket out of the stifling environment of guilt and blame. I packed my life into a few boxes, not knowing when or if I would return, driven by a desperate need for space and a fresh start. College presented a world of opportunities and challenges. The freedom it offered came with its own set of difficulties. The shadow of my family's turmoil followed me like a cloud, darkening even the brightest days. To support myself and avoid going back home, I took on 2 jobs. I juggled academics and work in a relentless cycle that left little room for rest or reflection. The campus library was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where I could lose myself among the stacks of books and the quiet. I worked as a shelver, a job that required meticulous attention to detail, organizing shelves, and maintaining the library's order and learning environment. It was a quiet, steady job that contrasted with the chaos of my personal life. The local coffee shop, on the other hand, was a bustling hub of activity. As a barista, I was a friendly face behind the counter, making lattes and cappuccinos for a stream of customers. The pace was relentless, and the environment was vibrant and sometimes overwhelming. Yet, there was joy in the rush, in the smiles of satisfied customers and the camaraderie with my coworkers. These jobs, though exhausting, gave me a sense of purpose. They were my escape from the turmoil at home, a way to prove to myself that I could stand on my own 2 feet. The satisfaction of earning my own money and being responsible for my own successes and failures was empowering. In the midst of long hours and tiredness, I found moments of happiness and pride in being busy and immersed in work and school. This helped me temporarily forget the bitterness of the past and focus on building a new future. But the question of whether my departure was justified or selfish remained unanswered. The emotional toll of separation and guilt was greater than I had anticipated, and the physical distance from my family did little to ease the burden of guilt and unresolved anger. I missed my father, who had been a source of quiet strength and support. My mother's accusations echoed in my mind, constantly reminding me of the rift between us. I often found myself questioning my choices, wondering if I had been a fool for leaving, for putting distance between me and my family. After graduation, I landed a steady job. It felt like both a triumph and a compromise, a step from the tumultuous past into a semblance of adult life marked by regular paychecks and small freedoms. The rare trips home were exercises in tension. The air was thick with unspoken recriminations and the heavy presence of my mother's lingering guilt. It wasn't that I didn't want to see my father, in fact, my heart ached for him. He seemed to be shrinking a little more with each passing day, his vitality sapped by illness and the domestic strife that surrounded him. Driven by a mixture of guilt and love, I set a new goal for myself, to earn enough money to afford the best possible treatment for my father. My career became more than just a job, it was a means to an end. Each promotion and raise was a step closer to providing him with the care he deserved. The irony of working tirelessly to support someone who, through no fault of his own, was not improving, was not lost on me. Despite my attempts to heal and move on, the news of my father's death brought me back to square one. One night, I received a phone call late, so late it felt like the world was holding its breath. It was my aunt on the other end, her voice calm but strained, with an unmistakable sadness. "Your father," she said, and in that moment, I felt the ground shift beneath me. My father had died after a long illness, an event we all knew was coming but had hoped to avoid. I was hundreds of miles away, wrapped in the cocoon of my new life, far from home, which had felt more like a battleground than a sanctuary in recent years. The pain of the news was like a sharp stab in the gut, a mixture of grief and guilt swirling in a storm I couldn't contain. My relationship with my family, especially with my mother, was strained at best, severed at worst. The finality of my father's departure cut through those tangled emotions and reminded me that beneath the resentment and misunderstandings, there was raw love for the man who, though not related by blood, had been a pillar in my life. There was no time to pack, no moment to sit and think about what to do. The urgency of the situation propelled me forward. Driven by a singular need to get back as quickly as possible, I took the first means of transportation I could find, a bus. I boarded at dawn, the early morning light casting long shadows that mirrored the heaviness in my heart. The journey was a blur, each mile stretching as I grappled with the reality of my father's death and the inevitable encounter with my family. I rehearsed confrontations and conversations in my head, preparing accusations and defenses, all the while feeling the growing knot of grief over the loss of a man who had shaped so much of who I was. Arriving at the funeral home, the gravity of the situation finally settled in as I saw my father lying there in repose, a peace on his face that had eluded him in his final years. The sight of him, so calm and serene, broke through the walls I had built around my heart. The sorrows that once seemed insurmountable now seemed petty in the face of such profound loss. My eyes traced the lines of his face, every wrinkle a testament to the life he had lived, the battles he had fought, and the love he had given, however imperfectly. As I stood before him, I was acutely aware of the finality of death, how it leaves no room for apologies, for mending fences, for saying all the things left unsaid. The weight of my unresolved emotions towards my family, my mother's harsh words and the guilt I carried crushed me in that moment. I wished for nothing more than to turn back the clock and relive those last moments with my father, armed with the knowledge of their fleeting nature. I longed to offer words of love instead of remaining silent. My father's passing was a great loss, a void that could never be filled. But it also served as a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of forgiveness, understanding, and compassion. As I stood amidst the somber faces of those who had known and loved him, I realized that holding on to anger and resentment served no purpose other than to prolong the pain. At that moment, all I felt was the piercing pain of missing a man who had been more than a father figure. He had been a guide, a confidant, and in his own way, a source of unwavering support. Standing at the end of the somber line, I extended my hand and offered a silent thank you to each person who had come to pay their respects to my father. The room was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by soft murmurs and the occasional shuffling of feet. It was a moment of closure, a final goodbye to a man who, despite the complexities of our relationship and the distance that had grown between us, had been a constant in my life. But that silence was shattered and my mother's voice rose sharply, laden with grief and accusation. "His death is partly due to him," she shouted, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "A cruel man for ignoring his father, a selfish person for going to college and not taking care of his family." Her words cut like daggers through the solemn atmosphere, turning heads and drawing a collective gasp from the assembled mourners. The accusation was a blow, not because it was new, but because of its public nature and timing. It was a reopening of wounds that had never fully healed, a reminder of the years of recriminations and misunderstandings that had driven a wedge between us. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. It was her initial accusations that had pushed me away, making me feel like an outsider in my own home. And now, as we stood together in grief, she chose to resurrect those old grievances, painting me as a villain in the eyes of those who had come to mourn my father. I felt my heart break all over again, not only for the loss of my father but also for the loss of what our family could have been. The grief was overwhelming, a flood of emotion. I had come to say goodbye, to find some semblance of peace in the wake of my father's passing. But instead, I was met with public condemnation from the one person whose acceptance I had longed for. The guests looked at me, some with sympathy, others with condemnation. I realized the futility of trying to defend myself, of trying to explain my side of the story to those who had only heard one version. The damage was done. My mother's words had painted me as the culprit, the son who had abandoned his family in their time of need. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew the weight of the guilt I had carried, having replayed that night in my mind countless times, wondering if things could have been different if I had acted sooner. I also knew the pain of being pushed away and blamed for something out of my control. It was a pain that had driven me to seek distance, to build a life away from the constant reminders of my perceived failures. As I stood there amidst the whispered conversations and sideways glances, I realized that my mother's words, while hurtful, did not define me. They were a reflection of her grief, her inability to cope with the loss of her husband and the strained relationship with her son. I felt the sadness that I shared with her, but I also knew that carrying the burden of her guilt would not bring my father back, nor would it heal the rift between us. So there I was, sitting on the porch of the funeral home. My tears fell quietly. The weight of my mother's public accusation had left me shattered, alone with my grief and the sting of her words. It felt like the ground beneath me had opened up and swallowed the last vestiges of what family meant to me. Then my aunt appeared. Her presence was a gentle reminder that I had not been completely abandoned. "Do you want to talk about the matter?" she asked, her voice soft, a stark contrast to the harshness I had just endured. I couldn't hold it in any longer. The dam broke and I told her everything, how my mother blamed me for my father's death, how she called me cruel and selfish in front of everyone. The words came out raw and unfiltered, and the pain and confusion I had carried for so long finally found an outlet. My aunt listened quietly, her expression a mix of sadness and empathy. When I finished, she sighed, a sound that expressed so much sorrow for her sister's actions and empathy for my situation. "Your mother is grieving and angry," she finally said, "but that's not excusing her words or how she treated you." I then told her the story of the night my father had fallen out of bed, the sound that had woken me from sleep, the horrifying discovery in the morning, and my frantic efforts to help. It was a confession of sorts, an attempt to explain my side of the story, to show that I wasn't the villain my mother had made me out to be. To my surprise, my aunt took my hand and squeezed it gently. "You are my new adopted son now," she said. She explained that her words were not just a statement but a promise, a pledge of support and acceptance that I hadn't realized I so desperately wanted. "And your mother does not deserve you, not if she cannot see the truth and the pain in your heart." Her words were like a lifeline to my soul. In the midst of my turmoil, I found a new sense of family, not bound by blood or obligation, but chosen. She was offering me a place to go when I felt nowhere to turn. As we sat there, with the cool evening air around us, I realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter. My aunt's acceptance and understanding gave me something to hold on to, a glimmer of hope in a time darkened by loss and misunderstanding. It was a reminder that family isn't always about who raises you, but who stands by you when the ground gives way beneath your feet. I understood in that moment that while my relationship with my mother might never be repaired, I wasn't as alone as I thought. And with my aunt's support, I might be able to find a way to cope with this new reality. Despite the pain and heartbreak, her words offered a way forward, a chance to rebuild from the ruin left by my father's death and my mother's guilt.